The 1970s gave us disco, bell-bottoms, and some of the strangest cartoons you'll ever see. Studios weren't afraid to take wild risks, throwing almost anything onto Saturday morning screens. Some ideas worked, others crashed and burned, but all of them left behind a trail of bizarre creativity. So, how many of these forgotten oddities do you even remember? Stick around, because some of these shows will make you question what animators were thinking. I Am the Greatest: The Adventures of Muhammad Ali. Imagine one of the most iconic athletes in history suddenly transformed into a Saturday morning cartoon hero. That's exactly what happened in 1977 with I Am the Greatest: The Adventures of Muhammad Ali. Yes, the real Ali lent his name, voice, and swagger to this short-lived animated series. The result? A mix of sports stardom, crime fighting, and strange storytelling that felt like a fever dream. In the cartoon, Ali didn't just float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. He jetted around the world, solving mysteries and stopping bad guys, often with his young sidekicks by his side. The episodes played out like a hybrid between Scooby-Doo and a superhero comic, except the central figure was a living legend in boxing gloves. But here's the kicker. The show lasted only 13 episodes before being yanked from the schedule. Why? Kids loved Muhammad Ali, but the plots were just too strange to keep audiences hooked. One episode had Ali battling robot duplicates. Another had him tackling spies. It was bold, yes, but also deeply confusing. Still, this cartoon stands as a bizarre time capsule of 1970s pop culture. It proved that TV executives were willing to gamble on turning real people into animated icons, even if the execution was clumsy. And let's face it, the idea of Muhammad Ali fighting cartoon villains with the same bravado he used in the ring is too strange to forget. Groovy ghoulies. Before there were cool vampire romances or polished monster reboots, there were the Groovy Ghoulies, an animated rock band made up entirely of classic monsters. Premiering in 1970, this cartoon blended slapstick comedy with music performances, serving up a mix that was equal parts spooky and silly. The show's main lineup featured Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman, except these weren't terrifying figures. Instead, they were goofy, bumbling characters who played in a garage band called the Groovy Ghoulies. Their songs were bubblegum pop, often with pun-filled lyrics about everyday life or wacky adventures. Think of it as the Monkees meet Halloween. Each episode was split between musical performances and short comedy sketches that poked fun at monster cliches. There was even a laugh track, making it feel like a cartoon version of a live sitcom. The villains weren't scary either. They were often humans who couldn't handle the quirky chaos of the monster crew. The Groovy Ghoulies didn't last long on their own, but left an odd legacy. They crossed over with other animated series, including Sabrina the Teenage Witch, making them part of a shared cartoon universe before that idea was trendy. Looking back, it's hard not to marvel at how bizarre this concept was. Monsters turned into bubblegum rock stars? It's the kind of idea that screams 1970s experimentation. The show didn't become a classic, but it still holds a cult status as one of the weirdest blends of horror and kid-friendly humor. Harlem Globetrotters. Everyone knows the Harlem Globetrotters as basketball showmen, but did you know they had their own Saturday morning cartoon? Premiering in 1970, the animated Harlem Globetrotters series took the real-life team and reimagined them as globe-trotting adventurers who solved mysteries while dazzling with their basketball skills. The show wasn't about games or tournaments. Instead, episodes followed the team as they traveled the world, encountering shady villains, greedy businessmen, or bizarre plots that needed foiling. How did they solve problems? With half-court trick shots, of course. Whether it was using a spinning basketball to unlock a safe, or bouncing one off walls to stop bad guys, their skills became cartoon superpowers. The team members were voiced by professional actors, not the real Globetrotters, but the energy and style still captured their larger-than-life personas. And in true Saturday morning fashion, every episode had a moral lesson tucked inside the comedy and antics. While kids found it entertaining, Critics at the time scratched their heads. Basketball plus mystery solving? It was a strange formula that only the 70s could produce. The show eventually spun off into a crossover with Scooby-Doo, cementing its reputation as a cultural oddity. Looking back, the animated Globetrotters may not have been the slam dunk TV executives hoped for, but it was undeniably unique. It turned a basketball team into cartoon superheroes, which is about as 1970s as you can get. Inch High, Private Eye. If you thought a detective story couldn't get any weirder, let me introduce you to Inch High, Private Eye. Premiering in 1973, this Hanna-Barbera cartoon featured a crime solver who was, quite literally, only 1 inch tall. His tiny size was supposed to be his greatest advantage, letting him sneak into places and uncover secrets that normal detectives couldn't. But here's where it gets bizarre. The show played it completely straight. Inch High worked at a detective agency, drove around in a special car, and went undercover on cases. Except instead of being treated as a novelty, his tiny stature was simply part of the job. Imagine Columbo, if Columbo could fit inside a teacup. He wasn't alone either. He had a partner, a secretary, and even a nephew tagging along on adventures. The formula was very Scooby-Doo, with mysteries to solve and villains to unmask, but the 1-inch twist gave it a surreal edge. The animation leaned heavily on slapstick, with Inch getting stepped on, flicked away, or hiding in ridiculous places. The series only lasted 1 season, and it's not hard to see why. While the premise was clever, it stretched the joke thin after a few episodes. Still, Inch High, Private Eye remains a prime example of how the 70s animation world was willing to gamble on any oddball idea. At its core, it's a cartoon about perspective, literally. And while audiences didn't stick around, its sheer strangeness keeps it alive in nostalgia discussions today. Hong Kong Phooey. Picture this: a bumbling janitor who transforms into a martial arts superhero with the help of a filing cabinet. That's the setup for Hong Kong Phooey, one of Hanna-Barbera's most bizarre hits of the 1970s. Debuting in 1974, the show starred Penry Pooch, a mild-mannered dog who worked at a police station. But whenever crime struck, he leapt into action as Hong Kong Phooey, master of kung fu, or at least he thought he was. Here's the twist. Phooey wasn't actually skilled at fighting. In fact, most of the time, his heroics went hilariously wrong. He'd fumble martial arts moves, get tangled in his own cape, or crash through walls. The real hero was usually his loyal cat sidekick, Spot, who saved the day while Phooey took the credit. The show rode the 1970s martial arts craze, cashing in on America's growing fascination with kung fu movies. It even had a catchy theme song that's still remembered fondly. But as entertaining as it was, the series leaned into absurdity. A dog superhero who doesn't actually know how to fight? That's cartoon comedy gold. Despite the nonsense, Hong Kong Phooey found an audience and lasted 16 episodes, more than many of its weirder peers. It became a cult classic, and even decades later, the character pops up in pop culture references. In the end, Phooey was less Bruce Lee and more Inspector Clouseau. And maybe that's why the show endures. It embraced silliness wholeheartedly, proving that even failure can be heroic if you look good doing it. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch. If you thought a car with personality was just a Pixar thing, think again. Back in 1974, Hanna-Barbera gave us Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, a show where vehicles were the main characters, complete with voices, attitudes, and rivalries. Wheelie was the plucky red car hero, constantly outsmarting a gang of rough-and-tumble motorcycles known as the Chopper Bunch. The entire series revolved around Wheelie trying to live his life, while Chopper and his gang caused chaos. Whether it was sabotaging races or pulling pranks, the motorcycles were relentless. Luckily, Wheelie always had a clever trick up his exhaust pipe to save the day. Think Roadrunner versus Wile E. Coyote, but with wheels and chrome. What made this cartoon bizarre wasn't just the concept of talking cars. That part was fun. It was the exaggerated personalities. From the bully-like motorcycles to Wheelie's squeaky clean do-gooder vibes. Each episode played like a playground rivalry taken to absurd extremes, complete with slapstick crashes and goofy sound effects. The show only lasted 1 season, which isn't surprising. It was charming, but also repetitive. And let's face it, a world where vehicles had full social lives didn't quite stick with audiences in the 70s. Still, it's remembered as a weird little precursor to modern car cartoons, proving that Hanna-Barbera was always ahead of the curve, literally. The Bugaloos. Imagine the Beatles, except they're teenagers dressed as insects, living in a magical forest, and constantly battling a campy villain named Benita Bizarre. That's The Bugaloos, a 1970 live-action/animated hybrid series from Sid and Marty Krofft. While technically more of a live-action kids show, it leaned heavily into cartoonish logic, making it one of the strangest 70s TV experiments. The Bugaloos were 4 British teens in colorful bug costumes who sang bubblegum pop songs and spread cheer. Their nemesis, Benita Bizarre, was a loud, over-the-top villain who lived in a giant jukebox-shaped castle and wanted to destroy their music. Every episode mixed psychedelic sets, oddball humor, and musical numbers. The show's surreal style fit right into the early 70s, when psychedelic influences were everywhere. Costumes were wild, the songs were sugary, and the storylines often made no sense. One week, the Bugaloos would be trapped in a weird machine. The next, they'd be saving the forest from another one of Benita's bizarre plots. While it only ran for 17 episodes, the Bugaloos remains a cult classic. Its mix of live action, cartoon sensibility, and music gave it a surreal edge that was both charming and utterly strange. You can see why it baffled some parents but captured kids' imaginations. It's pure 70s weirdness at its finest. Quasi at the Quackadero. If Saturday morning cartoons were strange, independent animation took weirdness to another level. Enter Quasi at the Quackadero, a 1975 short film that became a cult favorite in underground circles. Created by Sally Cruikshank, it told the story of 2 anthropomorphic ducks, Quasi and Anita, visiting a surreal amusement park. But this wasn't your average theme park. Attractions included time machines, dream recorders, and fortune-telling devices. The visuals were bright, psychedelic, and more than a little unsettling. With a style that looked straight out of a warped comic strip, the ducks wandered through, interacting with odd contraptions and eccentric characters, while a quirky jazz soundtrack kept things bouncing along. What made this cartoon bizarre wasn't just the art style, though that's unforgettable. It was the tone, part whimsical, part creepy, always unpredictable. Unlike mainstream cartoons, there wasn't a clear story arc. Instead, it felt like a guided tour through the artist's imagination, where logic took a back seat to surreal creativity. Though not widely known by kids of the era, Quasi at the Quackadero became a darling of animation students and indie fans. It was even added to the U.S. National Film Registry decades later, cementing its status as a landmark in experimental animation. It may not have aired on Saturday mornings, but it belongs on this list for proving just how bizarre 70s animation could get. Furies. Experimental animation in the 70s wasn't afraid to get bold, and Furies is proof. Released in 1977 by artist Sarah Petty, this short film didn't have talking animals or superheroes. It was a stylized, abstract piece that turned heads. The cartoon featured 3 winged female figures, painted in an Art Deco, Cubist-inspired style. They moved across the screen in choreographed patterns, accompanied by haunting music. There were no spoken words, no traditional gags, just raw visual artistry. The effect was both mesmerizing and unsettling, more like watching moving paintings than a cartoon. What made it bizarre is exactly what made it brilliant. It completely broke away from mainstream animation. At a time when Hanna-Barbera dominated TV with zany, formula-driven shows, Furies offered something totally different. It wasn't for kids sitting in front of cereal bowls. It was for film festivals and art lovers. Though it never reached mainstream audiences, Furies developed a reputation among animation buffs as one of the most daring short films of the decade. It showed that cartoons didn't have to tell jokes or feature mascots. They could be high art, pushing boundaries with style and mood. It may not have been Saturday morning fun, but in terms of bizarre 70s creations, this one deserves a top spot. Watching Furies is like stepping into another dimension of animation. Roland and Ratfink. If you love a good underdog versus villain setup, Roland and Ratfink delivers with a bizarre twist. This De Patti Freleng cartoon, which began in 1968 but bled heavily into the 70s, centered on the eternal battle between good and evil. Only here, evil was a bumbling, mustachioed, green-skinned villain named Ratfink, while good was represented by the cheerful and innocent Roland. The shorts played out like modern parables wrapped in slapstick. Ratfink tried endlessly to defeat Roland, whether by building ridiculous machines, cheating in contests, or hatching over-the-top schemes. And every single time, his plans backfired spectacularly. Roland, usually oblivious, always came out on top. The bizarre part was Ratfink himself. With his long nose, twisted mustache, and constant bad luck, he became a caricature of cartoon villainy. His designs were surreal, his failures exaggerated, and his persistence almost admirable. Meanwhile, Roland was bland by comparison, which only made the dynamic stranger. Audiences almost felt sorry for Ratfink, even as he played the classic role of bad guy. Though it didn't achieve the fame of Pink Panther or Looney Tunes, Roland and Ratfink carved out a weird niche. Its mix of absurd humor and oddball character design kept it memorable, even decades later. In short, it was a morality play wrapped in wacky hijinks, proving that the line between hero and villain can sometimes be hilariously thin. Dodo, the kid from outer space. Long before the slick alien animations of later decades, the 1970s had Dodo, the kid from outer space. Originally created in the 1960s but running well into the early 70s, this series introduced viewers to a rhyming alien boy with a propeller on his head and a duck-shaped computer as his companion. Sound strange already? It only gets stranger. Dodo's main gimmick was that he spoke entirely in rhyme, delivering every line in sing-song verse. This gave the show a surreal, almost hypnotic quality, as if Dr. Seuss had wandered into space cartoons. Pair that with his futuristic gadgets, like jet boots and shrink rays, and you had a character who was equal parts silly and inventive. The bizarre part wasn't just the rhyming, though. The plots were often disjointed, with Dodo leaping from one scenario to the next in a whirlwind of oddball situations. One moment he might be foiling a thief, the next he'd be rescuing animals or traveling through time. The duck-shaped computer offered advice, but often in ways that created more confusion than solutions. Though it didn't reach iconic status, Dodo, the kid from outer space, remains one of the stranger imports of the era. Its mix of rhymes, gadgets, and quirky humor made it stand out, even if audiences scratched their heads at the execution. In the pantheon of bizarre 70s cartoons, Dodo earns his spot simply for being so unapologetically weird. Sealab 2020. Before it became a cult hit parody in the early 2000s, Sealab 2020 was a straight-faced Saturday morning cartoon. Premiering in 1972, it imagined the not-so-distant future where humanity lived in an underwater research station called Sealab. The setup was ambitious: scientists exploring the ocean, studying marine life, and occasionally fighting off environmental threats. On paper, it sounded educational and futuristic. In practice, it was slow-paced, overly serious, and oddly unsettling. Instead of wacky hijinks, the episodes leaned into themes of pollution, overfishing, and ecological disaster. For kids expecting high-energy fun, the show felt more like a lecture disguised as a cartoon. But here's the bizarre twist. Decades later, the animation was recycled into Sealab 2021, a satirical, absurd comedy for adults that turned the stiff characters into wild caricatures. Suddenly, the once boring, eco-serious cartoon became the foundation for one of Adult Swim's earliest hits. Looking back at Sealab 2020, it's easy to see why it puzzled audiences in its own time. It was too grim for Saturday mornings, but too outlandish to pass as serious science fiction. Still, it stands as an example of how the 70s weren't afraid to take chances, even if the tone didn't quite match the medium. In the end, Sealab 2020 is remembered less for what it achieved in the 70s and more for how it was hilariously reinvented years later. And that strange afterlife makes it one of the most curious cartoons of the decade. Space Sentinels. Superheroes were everywhere in the 70s, but Space Sentinels gave the formula a bizarre twist. Premiering in 1977, the show featured 3 young heroes chosen by aliens to protect Earth: Hercules, Astrea, and Mercury. Yes, the same names you'd expect from mythology, but here they were reimagined as spandex-clad space defenders. Each hero had powers tied to their mythological inspiration. Hercules had super strength, Mercury had super speed, and Astrea could shapeshift into any animal. Together they lived aboard a giant orbiting computer named Sentinel-1, who acted as their guide and mission commander. Episodes pitted them against alien invaders, robots, and other over-the-top villains. But the strange part was the tone. Instead of lighthearted fun, Space Sentinels often came across as stiff and overly serious, with dialogue that felt more like comic book narration than natural conversation. Combine that with low-budget animation, and you had a show that felt both ambitious and awkward. The concept was wild enough to intrigue kids, but it never gained much traction. It was overshadowed by Super Friends, which had more recognizable characters and a lighter vibe. Still, Space Sentinels carved out its own niche, remembered today as one of those "did that really exist?" kinds of cartoons. In hindsight, it's both bizarre and admirable, a 70s attempt to fuse mythology, space opera, and Saturday morning superhero antics into one. And even if it fell short, it proves how far animators were willing to go to stand out. Tarzan and the Super 7. Now here's a mashup that screams 1970s excess. Tarzan and the Super 7. Airing in 1978. This wasn't just one show, it was a block of different cartoons bundled together under a single title. Tarzan was the headliner, but the real weirdness came from the company he kept. The Super 7 lineup included an odd assortment of mini cartoons: Web Woman, a female superhero with bug-inspired powers; Manta and Moray, a pair of underwater adventurers; the Freedom Force, a team of mythological heroes; and even Super Stretch and Micro Woman, a couple with elastic powers. It was a kitchen sink approach, tossing together unrelated heroes and hoping something would stick. The bizarre part wasn't just the variety, but the tone. Some stories leaned into environmental messages, others were straight superhero parodies, while Tarzan swung around doing his usual jungle thing. The styles clashed, and the block felt like flipping through random comic books with no rhyme or reason. Still, it had a certain charm. Kids got variety in one package, and the sheer randomness made it memorable. It was also one of the few shows at the time to spotlight a female superhero in Web Woman, which gave it a unique edge. In the end, Tarzan and the Super 7 is remembered less as a hit and more as a wild experiment. It's proof that the 70s had no problem throwing every idea at the wall, even if the result was a confusing jumble. The ABC Saturday Superstar movie. If the 1970s had one crown jewel of bizarre cartoon experiments, it was the ABC Saturday Superstar movie. Debuting in 1972, this wasn't a single show, but a series of animated TV movies that aired on Saturday mornings. Each week featured a different story, often serving as pilots for potential series. The result? A grab bag of oddball concepts that ranged from amusing to downright confusing. Some episodes reimagined live-action shows in animated form, like The Brady Kids, which turned the Brady Bunch into a cartoon with talking animals. Others took wild swings, such as Mad, Mad, Mad Monsters, a follow-up to Mad Monster Party. There were even crossovers, like Yogi's Ark Lark, which pulled together nearly every Hanna-Barbera character for an environmental road trip. The bizarre charm of the Saturday Superstar movie was its unpredictability. One week you might see a talking motorcycle, the next you'd get a superhero parody or a monster comedy. The tone was all over the place. Sometimes lighthearted, sometimes strangely serious. Most of the pilots never made it to full series, but that's what makes them fascinating today. They represent a graveyard of cartoon experiments, each one a glimpse into what might have been. Looking back, the Saturday Superstar movie feels like a bold but chaotic attempt to capture kids' attention. It was messy, sure, but it showcased the wild creativity of the era. For sheer variety and oddness, nothing else from the 70s comes close. The Addams Family. By the 70s, the Addams Family was already a pop culture phenomenon thanks to the live-action sitcom, but in 1973, Hanna-Barbera decided to bring them back as an animated series, and the result was wonderfully bizarre. In this version, Gomez, Morticia, Wednesday, Pugsley, Uncle Fester, and the rest of the gang weren't just hanging out in their spooky mansion. Instead, they were driving across the country in a haunted camper, solving mysteries and getting into misadventures like a gothic version of Scooby-Doo. The oddities originality here wasn't just the concept, it was the tone. The original live-action Addams Family thrived on dry, dark humor. The cartoon, however, softened their edges for Saturday morning audiences. Morticia and Gomez were less macabre and more playful, while Wednesday and Pugsley were turned into quirky, adventurous kids. Even stranger, the family's spooky vibe often clashed with the goofy plots. One episode had them entering a haunted ski resort, while another featured them befriending circus performers. It was less creepy, more kooky, though still filled with enough weirdness to remind you they weren't your typical family. Though it lasted only 16 episodes, the animated Addams Family remains a curious entry in their long history. It showed how the 70s could take something already unusual and crank the weirdness up another notch. Schoolhouse Rock. On the surface, Schoolhouse Rock doesn't sound bizarre. It was educational, after all. But think about it. How many kids' shows managed to teach grammar, multiplication, and civics through funky animated music videos? Premiering in 1973, this series was equal parts classroom and jukebox, making it one of the oddest success stories of the decade. Each segment lasted just a few minutes, tackling topics like conjunctions, electricity, or the American Revolution. The animation was simple but playful, and the real magic was in the music. Songs like Conjunction Junction and I'm Just a Bill became instantly memorable, embedding knowledge in kids' brains with catchy hooks and singable lyrics. The bizarre angle was how seamlessly it blended entertainment with actual learning. At a time when cartoons were usually about superheroes or slapstick, here was a show using jazz, rock, and funk to sneak school lessons into weekend mornings. The mix of groovy tunes, quirky characters, and surprisingly deep subject matter made it feel both fun and surreal. Kids didn't just watch Schoolhouse Rock, they absorbed it. Decades later, adults can still recall entire lyrics word for word, proof of how strange and effective the formula really was. What started as a quirky experiment ended up a cultural landmark, and while it may not feature superheroes or monsters, it earns its place on this list for proving that even learning could be bizarrely entertaining. In the 70s. Super Friends. When you think of superheroes, you picture epic battles, intense rivalries, and dramatic stakes. But in the 1970s, the Justice League got reimagined into one of the most bizarrely wholesome cartoons ever, Super Friends. Premiering in 1973, it featured Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and a rotating lineup of sidekicks and guest heroes. The odd part wasn't the characters, it was the tone. Instead of gritty heroics, the Super Friends were basically Saturday morning babysitters. They solved problems with teamwork and positive attitudes, often teaching kids lessons about recycling, honesty, or cooperation. Villains rarely posed serious threats, and more often than not, episodes ended with hugs, not punches. Adding to the strangeness were the sidekicks. Remember Wendy, Marvin, and their pet Wonder Dog? They were supposed to add comic relief, but often felt out of place next to legendary heroes. Later, the Wonder Twins, Zan and Jaina, joined the cast, with powers that ranged from turning into an eagle to, yes, a bucket of water. It was both hilarious and ridiculous. Despite the campiness, Super Friends ran for years and became many kids' first introduction to superheroes. It was bright, cheesy, and utterly different from the darker comics it was based on. Looking back, Super Friends is a reminder of just how bizarre 70s television could be. It took DC's most iconic characters and turned them into cartoon campfires of positivity. And maybe that's why it still holds nostalgic charm today. Motor Mouse and Autocat. If Hanna-Barbera had one go-to formula, it was endless animal rivalries. Enter Motor Mouse and Autocat, a short-lived cartoon that premiered in 1970 as part of Chattanooga Cats. It was basically Tom and Jerry with wheels, and that's exactly why it makes this list. Motor Mouse was a zippy little mouse on a motorcycle, while Autocat was a determined cat who built elaborate contraptions to catch him. Every episode followed the same pattern: chase, crash, repeat. The humor came from Autocat's constant failures and Motor Mouse's clever escapes. But what made this bizarre was the sheer oddness of the concept. A motorcycle-riding mouse? A cat who apparently had an unlimited budget for gadgets? The show leaned into absurd slapstick, with wild stunts, cartoon physics, and lots of screeching tires. It was a road race version of classic cat-and-mouse antics, and while entertaining, it was undeniably strange. The series only ran for a handful of episodes, buried within a larger cartoon package. It never reached the fame of its inspirations, but its sheer weirdness keeps it from being forgotten. In many ways, Motor Mouse and Autocat is a perfect example of how the 70s loved recycling old ideas in strange new forms. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was bizarre enough to leave an impression. Around the World in 79 Days. Closing out our list is a cartoon that truly embodies 70s eccentricity. Around the World in 79 Days. Airing in 1969, but running into the 70s, it was Hanna-Barbera's animated spin on Jules Verne's classic adventure novel. But instead of a grand, serious tale, it gave us a goofy, slapstick-filled race around the globe. The story followed three teens, Phineas, Jenny, and Wheelie, who attempted to circle the world in 79 days, just one day faster than Verne's famous fictional wager. Of course, they weren't alone. Hot on their heels was their rival, Crumden, who constantly schemed to sabotage their journey. Each episode featured a new location, filled with broad stereotypes, exaggerated landmarks, and plenty of zany escapades. The humor was classic Hanna-Barbera, pratfalls, chase sequences, and recycled sound effects galore. But the sheer randomness of the places and plots gave the series its bizarre flavor. One week, the teens were racing through Egypt. The next, they were caught in a South American jungle, dodging Crumden's latest tricks. It wasn't a huge hit, and it quietly faded after just a single season. But as far as oddball 70s cartoons go, it's a prime example. A world race, teen heroes, slapstick villains, it was as ambitious as it was strange. Today, Around the World in 79 Days is remembered as one of those, wait, that was real? Shows, and yes, it was. So there you have it, 20 of the most bizarre cartoons the 1970s ever threw at audiences. From inch-high detectives to monster rock bands, the decade proved there was no limit to how weird Saturday mornings could get. Which of these oddities do you actually remember, and which ones blew your mind today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into TV's strangest experiments. After all, the weirdest stories are always worth retelling.